The Dren Dominion had spent centuries perfecting the art of conquest. Their fleets were unmatched, their weapons devastating, and their tactics honed by countless campaigns across the stars. They believed no species could truly resist their power, and history had proven them right. Every planet they set their eyes on eventually fell either through sheer force or calculated subjugation. When their eyes turned to Earth, it was with complete confidence that the outcome would be the same to the Dren humans. We're nothing more than a minor complication, a young and fractured species still dependent on fossil fuels, still divided by artificial borders and ideological squabbles, and still incapable of true unity or advancement. In the eyes of the Dominion, humanity was ripe for the taking. The invasion plans were drawn up with cold precision. High General Carax, a veteran of dozens of successful planetary invasions, was chosen to lead the operation. His record was flawless, his demeanor calm and calculated, and he approached the Earth campaign with the same detachment he would have applied to any other target. The strategy followed a familiar blueprint: orbital bombardment to disable critical infrastructure drone waves, to secure urban centers, and coordinated ground assaults to dismantle organized resistance before it could take root. There would be no need for mass slaughter. The Dominion preferred clean and efficient victories with minimal collateral damage. The objective was control, not destruction, and Carax had no reason to believe Earth would be any different. The invasion began without warning. Massive Dren battlecruisers emerged from hyperspace and took positions in Earth's orbit without so much as a declaration of intent. Within minutes, coordinated strikes were launched against military installations, communication satellites, and power grids around the world. Command centers from Washington, D.C. to Moscow to Beijing went dark as precision plasma blasts severed their networks and destroyed. Their command hierarchy's fighter jets never made it off the ground. Tanks were turned to molten metal on their platforms, and naval vessels found themselves adrift without direction or communication systems. Within hours, chaos spread through the ranks of Earth's defenders, and civilians were left stunned and terrified. Dren drones swept through the skies, releasing electromagnetic pulses that disabled electronics and dropped incapacitating gas into key resistant zones in cities like Los Angeles. Paris and Cairo, heavily armed Dominion infantry deployed from orbit, secured government buildings with mechanical precision and established perimeter control around vital logistical nodes. Their presence was overwhelming and their coordination near perfect. Within 2 days, Carax received confirmation from his generals that major cities were under control, and resistance had been minimal. Local militaries had been either destroyed or surrendered. Without much of a fight, the remaining armed forces were scattered. Leaderless and demoralized Earth's communication networks were in shambles, and its governments unable to organize a coherent response. Analysts aboard the command ship calculated that Earth's full submission would likely occur within 10 days. Carax was pleased but not surprised. The data matched the projections, and he began drafting the administrative structure for Earth's integration into the Dominion. Governors would be appointed from among his senior staff. Resource extraction schedules would be established and cultural assimilation protocols distributed to educational centers. Carax even entertained the idea of using Earth as a forward operations base for future campaigns into the Outer Rim sectors. Its strategic location and abundant resources made it a valuable acquisition. But as he looked down at the planet spinning below him, he felt no awe, no curiosity, only the cold certainty of conquest. This was what the Dominion did, and it had done it well for generations. Earth was nothing more than another piece in a growing galactic puzzle, another species that would eventually forget what it once was and become just another cog in the grand machine. Reports from the surface continued to confirm success. Dominion troops met little organized resistance. The occasional firefight with a remaining military holdout or a police unit happened, but never lasted long. Drones quickly adapted to human tactics and neutralized them, with superior firepower. Casualties among Dren forces were almost non-existent, which further reinforced the belief that the campaign was proceeding flawlessly. Carax monitored everything from his observation deck, reviewing heat maps, troop movements, intercepted human transmissions, and field recordings of skirmishes. One video showed a group of Earth soldiers attempting to defend a radio tower in South America, only to be overwhelmed within minutes. Another showed a convoy of Dren tanks rolling unopposed through the empty streets of Berlin as civilians watched from windows too afraid to act. The psychological impact of the invasion was clear. Fear was spreading faster than any resistance could form, and fear was the Dominion's most powerful ally. Earth's population had never experienced a threat of this magnitude. The invasion was so sudden, so coordinated, so absolute, that many humans had not even processed what was happening before their cities were surrounded, their leaders captured or killed, and their armies scattered. The message was simple and devastating: resistance is futile, surrender is survival. Carrax believed the campaign would be remembered not for its violence, but for its efficiency in the Dominion archives. It would be filed as a textbook example of strategic superiority. As Earth fell quietly into submission, Carrax turned his focus to the next phase. Long-term occupation. He called for cultural analysts to begin drafting indoctrination materials. He tasked engineers with identifying suitable locations for Dominion bases and infrastructure. He ordered security protocols to ensure no uprisings would emerge. And he authorized scientific teams to study the human genome and assess any potential biotechnological benefits Earth could offer to the Dominion machine. In his mind, it was over: the war, the resistance, the hope for freedom. It was all over before it had truly begun. Earth was a conquered world, now its fate sealed by the very moment the Dominion fleet entered its atmosphere. Carrax stood tall in the command chamber, hands clasped behind his back as the stars reflected off the surface of the observation glass. He did not smile, for he was not a man of emotion, but if he had been, he might have smiled then, because from every angle, every report, every data set, Earth was his victory, complete, inevitable, and absolute. What he failed to see was the silence between the signals, the faint patterns in the forest, the missing patrols in the desert, and the eyes that watched from the shadows, waiting, biding their time. Because while Carrax believed Earth had fallen, the real war had only just begun. At first, everything went exactly as the Dren Dominion had expected. Their forces encountered minimal resistance and secured key territories with mechanical efficiency. High General Carrax received daily reports confirming successful operations across all major continents. Cities were subdued, power grids and communication systems remained under Dominion control, and local populations were too disoriented to mount any real opposition. It looked like another swift victory in a long line of conquests. But then subtle changes began to emerge. It started in the dense forests of North America, where a routine scouting mission vanished without explanation. A small recon team was sent to track a group of retreating human soldiers. Their last transmission was normal reporting, heat signatures, and movement near the tree line, but then they went silent. A second team was dispatched equipped with drones and additional firepower. Their scanners picked up faint traces of body heat, but the signal vanished and contact was lost. A third team sent to investigate found no survivors. Only fragments of gear and a single transmission from a damaged drone showing a crude pitfall trap, lined with sharpened wooden stakes soaked in blood. The Dren were confused. Traps of this kind were beneath the level of warfare they were used to. They relied on overwhelming firepower, superior strategy, and clean victories. They had never faced enemies who fought like predators, hiding in terrain, using the environment to their advantage, and vanishing before they could be caught. Carrax dismissed the incident as an isolated event, perhaps a desperate act by a few rogue soldiers. But the reports continued to escalate across the deserts of Australia. Entire platoons disappeared, their final messages fragmented and filled with static. One message included the words sandstorm and ambush, but it was too garbled to decipher fully. Some survivors returned dazed, injured, and unable to describe what had happened. The terrain they once deemed clear became hostile. Without warning, drones were destroyed or hijacked, and supply lines began encountering sabotage in Asia. The cities that had once seemed compliant turned chaotic at night. Guerrilla fighters emerged from alleyways and underground tunnels, launching hit-and-run attacks on Dominion patrols and melting into the crowds by day. Dominion forces found themselves surrounded in plain sight, unable to trust the civilians they had once considered pacified. It was not just the cities, rural villages, and open plains became battlegrounds where no line could be drawn, no perimeter secured. In rural Africa, supply convoys went missing, vehicles were found abandoned, burned, or riddled with improvised explosives. The humans were not fighting like soldiers. They were not organizing into formal ranks or following standard military protocols. They were hunting, learning, adapting, and striking. Without hesitation, the Dren began to notice that these acts of resistance were not random. They followed patterns, they showed coordination. The enemy they thought was broken was reorganizing beneath their feet. Carrick's called an emergency briefing. His commanders reported the same anomalies appearing in all regions. The humans were fighting back with increasing effectiveness, and their methods were completely unpredictable. They were using repurposed farming equipment, makeshift explosives, and old hunting rifles, but still managing to inflict damage on Dominion troops that outclassed them in every category. Some drones captured by humans were returned as ticking bombs. Some hacked to return false data during critical missions. Sabotage became widespread and effective. Dominion communications were jammed. Navigation systems were scrambled and thermal cloaking became useless, as humans figured out how to counter it with nothing but mud, cold water, and patience. Even nature itself was turned into a weapon. Forests became death traps. Deserts swallowed armored columns and bombed out buildings, became sniper nests and ambush points for all their technology and structure. The Dominion was being dragged into a kind of warfare it was entirely unprepared for, and Carax began to realize this was not going to be another clean victory. He underestimated the humans' resolve, and more importantly, he underestimated their ability to adapt. The Dren had trained to fight disciplined opponents who surrendered. Once overwhelmed, the humans were something else entirely. They refused to follow the script, and worse, they seemed to thrive in the chaos. They were being pushed to the brink, and instead of breaking, they were becoming more dangerous, more organized, and more united. Carax ordered tactical adjustments, increased surveillance, and more aggressive patrols. But it was too late. The shift had already begun. A war that was supposed to end in days was now entering a new phase, one where the rules no longer applied and the enemy refused to play. By any known logic or expectation, the humans were no longer just resisting. They were evolving with every attack, with every sacrifice, and with every fallen fighter. They were becoming a force the Dominion had never encountered before, and it terrified them even if they did not yet admit it aloud. The longer the invasion stretched, the more the Dren realized they were facing something far more dangerous than primitive weaponry or outdated technology. They were facing a mindset they had never encountered before. The humans were not behaving like any species the Dominion had conquered in the past. Most civilizations, when confronted with overwhelming force, chose to surrender or negotiate. They valued survival and understood the futility of resistance in the face of advanced firepower. But humans did not follow that path. They defied every expectation. They screamed when they should have begged. They attacked when they should have retreated, and they laughed when they should have been. Terrified, Dominion soldiers began to speak in hushed tones about their strange behavior, calling them the unruly ones, a term that initially was meant as a joke, but soon became a warning. The humans were unpredictable, relentless, and disturbingly fearless. They did not hide from danger. They ran toward it with improvised weapons in hand and fire in their eyes. The Dren were trained for structured combat, clean engagements with clear objectives and manageable threats. But none of that applied here. Because humans were not following the rules of war, they fought dirty, they fought smart, and most of all, they fought like they had nothing to lose. Dominion patrols would enter seemingly quiet zones, only to be ambushed from rooftops or attacked by civilians posing as non-combatants. Supply drops were intercepted and rerouted. Drones were hijacked or hacked and then weaponized against their creators. Human fighters were spotted wearing scavenged Dren armor, laughing as they turned enemy equipment back. On its owners, these people were not just soldiers, they were survivors, and there was a difference. A soldier fights under orders for duty or for honor, but a survivor fights because the alternative is death, and they fight with everything they have. Every scrap of metal, every ounce of strength, every desperate idea turned into action. The humans were taking everything the Dominion threw at them and using it to fight back harder, stronger, and smarter. They were not just reacting, they were adapting and evolving with alarming speed. Carax ordered a full purge protocol. The Dominion would no longer attempt to control the planet through occupation or integration. If the humans refused to obey, then they would be exterminated. He authorized wide-scale bombardments on areas of resistance. Entire towns were leveled from orbit forests, were burned to smoke out. Hiding fighters and drones were programmed to eliminate anything that moved without scanning for identification, but for every strike, more humans emerged. It was like trying to put out a fire by blowing on it. Every village destroyed gave rise to 10 more fighters, and each of them more determined than the last. They began forming units and giving themselves names. Names that struck fear into the hearts of Dominion soldiers. The Wolverines, the Iron Fangs, the Sons of Liberty. Their insignias were crude, painted on walls and stitched into old jackets, but they carried meaning. Their weapons were cobbled together from scrap and debris. Old hunting. Rifles, fertilizer, bombs, metal rods, sharpened into spears. Yet somehow they worked. Dominion soldiers began to dread nightfall, because that was when the humans came for them. They would strike under cover of darkness, then vanish without a trace. Cities that were once thought secure became battlegrounds, and no patrol returned. Without casualties, Karax was infuriated. His forces were technologically superior. They had better armor, better weapons, better coordination, and yet they were being pushed back by what he considered savages. It made no sense. He demanded answers, and his advisors offered only guesses. They lack discipline, he shouted, slamming a clawed fist onto the command table. They fight like animals, like madmen. One advisor responded quietly. They fight like they have nothing to lose, and that comment silenced the room because it was true. The Dominion fought for conquest, for glory, for the growth of their empire, but the humans fought for survival, for each other, and for something deeper. Something the Dren could not understand. And that made them dangerous. They did not fear death because they knew it was always a possibility. They did not hesitate to make sacrifices because their cause was greater than anyone's life, and they did not run from the enemy because they had nowhere to run. They were cornered and desperate, and there was nothing more lethal than a species with its back against the wall. The more Karax tried to crush them, the more the humans resisted, and their resistance was not fueled by hope of victory, but by the sheer refusal to give up. They fought with grit, with fury, and with a sense of unity the Dominion had never seen before. What should have been a clean and simple conquest was turning into a war of attrition, and the Dren were beginning to understand the true cost of underestimating humanity. The humans were rewriting the rules of warfare, not with superior firepower, but with determination, cunning, and a will to survive that refused to break even under the full weight of galactic oppression, and in doing so they were teaching the Dominion a lesson it would never forget. The turning point came during the siege of Moscow, a city the Dominion believed would fall as easily as all the rest. Its defenses had been crippled in the initial wave. Its military units scattered, its infrastructure shattered. Dren forces surrounded the city and moved in with calculated precision, expecting to mop up the last of the resistance with minimal effort. The plan was simple: overwhelm the defenders, take control of key locations, and establish a central command node to project Dominion authority across the region. But what happened instead defied every expectation as the Dren approached the outer districts. They were met not with surrender, but with fire. The humans had set their own city ablaze. The fires spread rapidly, consuming entire blocks, faster than Dominion containment teams could react. Thick black smoke filled the air, disrupting drone vision and choking out radio. Transmissions visibility dropped to near zero as flames engulfed the streets and buildings crumbled under the heat. But it was not just the fire that threw the Dren into disarray. It was what came out of it. Human fighters emerged from the inferno like wraiths, their faces blackened with soot, their eyes burning with fury. They carried weapons ripped from fallen Dren soldiers, plasma rifles strapped to their backs and blades scavenged from battlefields. They moved with purpose, not like a disorganized mob, but like a force that had waited for this moment. Their attack was sudden, brutal, and coordinated. They struck from rooftops, sewers, and alleyways, setting ambushes in the chaos of smoke and flame. Dominion soldiers found themselves isolated units cut off and overwhelmed. They tried to regroup, but every fallback position was already compromised. It was as if the humans had predicted every move the Dren would make and planned for it long before the siege even began for the first time in the invasion. Dren forces broke ranks and retreated. They did not just lose a battle, they fled in panic. The streets of Moscow, which were supposed to be under Dominion control, were now a burning graveyard of ruined vehicles, broken armor, and fallen warriors. Carrax received the reports with disbelief. He demanded explanations. His generals cited unexpected resistance, environmental hazards, and sabotage. But the truth was clear. The humans had turned the city itself into a weapon, and they had done it with a level of strategic madness that bordered on genius. Carrax could not understand it. He reviewed footage of the battle again and again, trying to find logic in the chaos, but there was none, at least none, that fit into the Dominion's models. The humans had not acted like a military force. They had not engaged in proper formations or tactical maneuvers. They had fought like a wildfire, spreading, consuming, and impossible to contain. They had used their own destruction as cover and turned it into a weapon. Their willingness to burn their own city to strike back at their invaders shook the Dominion to its core. In a debriefing with his senior officers, Carrax slammed his fist against the table, demanding to know how primitives like these could outfight one of the most advanced military machines in the galaxy. They lack discipline, he roared. They fight like animals, like they don't care about their own lives. But one of his officers, a veteran of many campaigns, responded quietly, "Perhaps that's exactly why we're losing. They fight like they have nothing to lose." The room fell silent. The comment echoed in Carrax's mind long after the meeting ended. The Dren fought for conquest, for empire, for the pride of the Dominion. But the humans fought for survival, for their families, for their homes, for the idea that freedom was worth dying for. They did not measure victory in territory gained, but in every second they denied the Dominion control. The more Carrax thought about it, the more it disturbed him, because it meant the humans could not be broken, not by logic, not by force, not even by fear. They had already accepted death, and that made them invincible in a way the Dominion could never understand. The defeat at Moscow was not just a tactical loss, it was a psychological fracture. It proved that the humans could not only resist, they could win, and not through superior firepower, but through sheer determination and willingness to sacrifice everything. The flames of Moscow spread more than smoke. They spread an idea that the Dominion was not invincible, that even the most powerful fleet in the galaxy could be pushed back by those who refused to kneel. And from that moment on, the invasion changed, because now it was not just about suppressing resistance. It was about trying to contain a spirit that could not be extinguished, a fire that had already spread beyond their control and was now burning across the world with no sign of stopping. After the catastrophe in Moscow, Carrax abandoned all thoughts of diplomacy or occupation. He had underestimated the humans once, and he would not make that mistake again. The new directive was simple: total eradication. If the humans refused to submit, they would be wiped out from existence. Orbital strikes were authorized without restriction. Cities under Dominion control were targeted not for strategic value but as examples. Entire population centers were reduced to glowing craters. From space plasma, bombardments rained down on London, Sao Paulo, and Beijing, leaving nothing but ash and silence behind. The order was clear. This was no longer a campaign of conquest, it was extermination. Civilian casualties were no longer a concern. Collateral damage was encouraged. The goal was fear and submission through overwhelming destruction. But the humans did not cower. They did not scatter or beg for mercy. Instead, they grew stronger. For every city that was leveled, more fighters emerged from the rubble, their eyes burning with a hatred that surpassed all logic. Resistance groups that once operated independently began coordinating across continents, sharing resources, strategies, and intelligence. They were not just surviving, they were adapting, growing, evolving into something far more dangerous than the Dominion had ever anticipated. Human leaders appeared on hijacked broadcasts, issuing defiant messages to the invaders, daring them to strike again. One particularly infamous transmission ended with the words, "Burn it all. You'll find us waiting in the ashes." And the Dren did again and again. They turned thriving cities into smoldering ruins, but each time they did, the humans returned fiercer than before. The destruction forged them into something unstoppable. Dren patrols in areas deemed secure began vanishing with disturbing frequency. Entire units would disappear without a trace. Their vehicles found days later filled with blood, but no bodies. The wilderness turned hostile. Forests, once scanned and cleared, became killing grounds laced with traps. explosives, and hidden ambushes. Drenning. Scanners would show nothing, and then suddenly units would be attacked from all sides by enemies that seemed to rise from the ground itself. The ruins of bombed cities became urban jungles where humans moved like ghosts, striking with precision, then vanishing into the shadows before the Dren could respond. The Dominion forces were structured and methodical, relying on disciplined formation and chain of command. But those very traits became weaknesses in the chaotic new battlefield they faced. No front lines, no clear targets, no predictable patterns. The humans had turned every rule of war into a weapon against the invaders. Their greatest advantage was not their strength, but their unpredictability. Carax's patience wore thin. Each failed campaign, each destroyed patrol, each humiliating broadcast chipped away at his authority. The Dominion had crushed civilizations far more advanced than Earth, yet here they were being harassed and bled dry by a species that was supposed to be primitive. He ordered more aggressive measures, more troops, more drones, more chemical and biological agents. Entire forests were doused with defoliants and toxins to flush out human fighters. But the results were the same: death for Dominion forces and renewed fury from the enemy. Even areas where resistance had supposedly been crushed erupted into violence within days, as if the humans had planned for every possibility. The Dominion could not find a foothold. No matter how many times they struck, the humans would not stay. Down, they rearmed with weapons forged from Dominion wreckage. They regrouped in the ruins of homes and cities destroyed by orbital fire, and they rebuilt faster than the Dren could destroy them. Every setback only hardened their resolve. Every loss fueled their determination. Even Dominion troops began to falter. Fear crept into the ranks as the idea took hold that perhaps this enemy could not be beaten. Whispers spread about human tactics, about fighters who used the bones of their fallen to craft new weapons, about ambushes where Dominion soldiers were lured by recorded voices only to walk into fields of landmines, about stories of fighters emerging from infernos, laughing as they attacked with blades still glowing from heat. Whether true or not, these stories fed a growing panic. Carax's once unshakable authority began to erode. His name, once spoken with reverence, was now followed by doubt and silence among his own commanders. Desperate for a decisive victory, he searched for any opportunity to deliver a crippling blow to the resistance, something to remind both his troops and the humans that the Dominion still held power. He would have it soon or risk losing everything, not just the war, but the fear and control that had defined the Dren for centuries. And as the humans continued to rise from the ashes, more united, more ruthless, and more determined, Carax could feel the war slipping further from his grasp, and with it the legacy of the Dominion he had sworn to preserve at any cost. Dominion's advanced technology, which had always guaranteed their victories, was no longer giving them the edge they relied on. What started as isolated incidents quickly became a systemic problem across the entire invasion force. Dren drones that once patrolled human cities with impunity began to drop from the sky, lifeless and unresponsive. Their systems fried by crude yet effective EMP mines planted by human saboteurs. Stealth units outfitted with thermal cloaking were rendered useless as humans learned to outmaneuver them with nothing more than mud-cold environments and absolute stillness. Entire squads lay in wait for hours, hidden under debris and freezing conditions, unmoving until it was time to strike. Dominion forces could not comprehend such patience or such disregard for comfort or survival, but the humans operated on a different kind of endurance, one rooted in desperation and resilience. It wasn't just the battlefield where the tide began to shift. It was in the systems the Dominion believed were untouchable. Human hackers, once thought incapable of breaching Dominion code, managed to infiltrate key command networks, redirecting supply drones mid-flight to resistance camps or causing food shipments to self-destruct at their intended destinations. Others poisoned water reserves or overloaded generators, turning the very lifeblood of the occupation into weapon supply lines were cut off entirely in some sectors, not by superior force but by manipulation and sabotage, as convoys were rerouted into ambushes or destroyed by hidden explosives placed along their paths. Nothing was safe, not even the flagship Velan, the pride of the Dominion fleet, a symbol of power and invulnerability orbiting Earth, with an arsenal unmatched by any other vessel in known space. Its shielding systems were said to be impervious to external assault. Its control systems encoded with security protocols built over centuries. Yet all of that meant nothing when humans turned the ship's own technology against it. Through an astonishingly audacious breach, human hackers managed to override the Vilan's navigation controls, disabling its safeguards and locking out emergency overrides. In a matter of minutes, the vessel's descent began as Dominion commanders scrambled to regain control. The flagship plunged through the atmosphere like a falling star crashing into the Atlantic Ocean with a force that sent shockwaves across the planet. The resulting tidal wave was visible from orbit, and the loss of the Vilan sent a psychic tremor through the entire Dominion war machine. Carax stood on his command deck in stunned silence, watching the aftermath unfold. His mind struggling to process the impossible. The humans had destroyed the most powerful ship in the fleet, not through brute force, but by using intellect, strategy, and nerve. The implications were devastating. If the Vilan could fall, what else could they destroy? It wasn't just a tactical loss, it was a collapse of confidence, a crack in the foundation of fear. The Dominion had always instilled in its enemies, and now that fear was being turned against them, Dominion soldiers, once proud and confident, began to question their safety. Morale plummeted, whispers of defeat crept into the ranks, and more than once Carax had to reassign troops who refused to serve near active resistance zones, many citing the destruction of the Vilan as the moment they realized the humans could actually win. Carax refused to accept that. He issued threats, increased rotations, and punished insubordination, but none of it stopped the slow erosion of authority. The loss of the Vilan proved something far more terrifying than any casualty count. The humans could not be predicted, and they could not be contained. They learned too fast, adapted too well, and struck where it hurt most. And what frightened the Dominion even more was that the humans seemed to relish it. They took pride in outmaneuvering their invaders. They celebrated sabotage and destruction, not out of bloodlust, but out of defiance. Every hacked drone, every destroyed shipment, every failed operation was a declaration that they would not stop until the Dominion left or was destroyed. Carax began to understand that this was no longer a conventional war. It was a campaign of attrition, one the Dominion was ill-prepared to fight. The humans didn't need to win every battle. They only needed to make the cost of victory unbearable. And with every successful infiltration, every system failure, every explosion in the night, they chipped away at the illusion of control that the Dominion had always relied on. And beneath it all was a terrifying truth. The humans were not just resisting, they were evolving into something stronger, something smarter, and far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. They were using every tool, every weakness, every mistake, and turning it into a weapon. And as the war dragged on, Carax knew that even with all the firepower, all the ships and soldiers the Dominion had brought to bear, they were slowly but surely losing, not because of numbers or strength, but because the humans refused to let them win on any front. And in that refusal, they had become the Dominion's greatest nightmare. Desperate for a decisive blow that could turn the tide of the war, Carax seized upon intelligence reports suggesting the location of a high-value human resistance cell buried deep within the Rocky Mountains. It was believed that this group had been coordinating many of the global strikes that had crippled Dominion forces. If they could be eliminated, Carax reasoned it would break the human momentum and send a message to both sides that the Dominion was still in control. He chose to lead the operation himself, determined to restore order through overwhelming force. At dawn, Dominion dropships pierced the thick clouds above the mountains, deploying squadrons of elite soldiers equipped with the best armor and weapons the Dominion had left. Carax's personal guard accompanied him across the rugged terrain. Scanning the cliffs and valleys with precision, drones flew ahead, broadcasting clear paths and scanning for threats, but found no signs of life. It appeared the humans had not yet detected their approach. Everything was too quiet. Carax took it as a sign of weakness, as confirmation that the humans were finally running out of options. He pushed his forces forward, demanding speed and aggression. When they reached the bunker entrance, there was still no resistance. The outer perimeter was untouched. The air was still, and not a single shot had been fired. Carax ordered the breach, expecting a brief firefight, followed by swift victory. But the moment his troops passed through the heavy blast doors, the first explosion tore through the rocky ground. Mines buried deep beneath the surface detonated in sequence, causing sections of the mountain to collapse. Debris rained down, crushing entire squads beneath tons of rock and fire. The formation scattered, and Carax howled for his forces to push forward to break through the chaos and secure the objective, his command echoing over the rumble of falling stone inside the bunker. The halls were dimly lit, the walls covered in strange symbols and crude graffiti, mocking the Dominion in the human language. It was not a command center. It was not even a forward base. As Carax pushed deeper, he realized it was a trap. The resistance leaders were never here, and the entire location had been rigged for destruction. Dominion soldiers trying to regroup were ambushed in tight corridors. Human fighters struck from the shadows, using scavenged Dominion weapons and explosives, crafted from salvaged materials. The fighting was close, brutal, and unrelenting. Dren soldiers were trained for open battle, not close quarters, in twisting underground tunnels, and they fell in droves. Even Carax's elite guards struggled to maintain formation as more waves of humans appeared from hidden passages, masked and armored in gear, made from the very enemies they were killing. Carax fought with rage, cutting through the attackers with precision, but every victory came at a cost, and he could feel the weight of the battle pressing down with each step. By the time they reached the central chamber, half of his forces were dead or incapacitated, and those still fighting were exhausted, wounded, and surrounded. The humans had no intention of letting them escape. The assault had been anticipated, every route planned, every exit mined, every fallback point turned into a kill zone. As Carax finally gave the order to retreat, his soldiers scrambled back toward the surface only to find the path blocked by fresh waves of human fighters, shouting battle cries that echoed across the valley above them. Human aircraft retrofitted from Dominion wreckage descended like vultures, launching rockets at the remaining dropships. Carax's forces ran for their lives, only to be caught in a final wave of fire and shrapnel. Every planned escape route had been sabotaged. Every landing pad targeted the last few transport. Ships were destroyed before they ever left the ground. Carax reached the final functioning dropship with only a handful of troops and ordered immediate takeoff as the ship rose above the battlefield. Carax looked down at the chaos below the flames, the smoke, the cheering humans standing atop the wreckage of what had once been his proud invasion force, and something inside him shifted. This was not a loss. This was humiliation. His name, once feared across the galaxy, was now being spoken with derision and contempt, not just by his enemies, but by his own troops who had watched him lead them into a slaughter. Carax had fought countless wars, had broken the will of empires and civilizations, and yet here on a single backward planet, he had been outmaneuvered and outfought not by a rival military, but by survivors, people who refused to die quietly and who turned every defeat into a weapon. Their defiance was not just military, it was spiritual, and it made them dangerous in a way the Dominion had never faced before. The retreat from the Rocky Mountains was not just another tactical failure, it was the moment Carax truly began to fear that the Dominion might not survive this war, and worse, that he might be remembered not as a conqueror, but as the one who led them to ruin, as the Dominion fleet reeled from the failed assault in the Rocky Mountains. Carax knew he was running out of time. Control was slipping from his grasp, and with it the image of Dren's superiority that had kept order through fear for him. Centuries' resistance forces were no longer scattered cells reacting to invasion. They had become a coordinated global movement with a clear goal and an unwavering spirit. Human attacks were increasing in scale, precision, and frequency, no longer random. They were striking at key logistical points, disrupting communications, destroying fuel supplies, hijacking orbital sensors, and dismantling anything that could give the Dominion a tactical advantage. Carax stood aboard his command ship reviewing the endless stream of failure reports from every corner of the planet and came to a brutal conclusion. If the humans refused to surrender and would not be broken by terror, then they would be erased completely. He issued the most extreme order of his career: activate the Planet Killer device's weapons, so destructive that even the Dominion had deemed them forbidden. Except in the direst of circumstances, these weapons were designed not just to conquer, but to obliterate, capable of rendering entire. Continents uninhabitable, Carax's advisors hesitated, visibly disturbed by the implications, but his glare silenced their concerns. Preparations began at once, targeting. Algorithms were uploaded, reactors charged, payloads armed, and coordinates locked. But before the weapons could be deployed, the alarm sounded. Dominion sensors detected multiple unidentified vessels breaching their outer perimeter. At first, the data seemed implausible. The ships were of human origin, but cobbled together from salvage and old technology, yet they moved with uncanny precision and speed. What should have been a patchwork flotilla of mismatched craft was operating like a disciplined navy. They tore through outer defenses with startling efficiency. Their strikes were surgical targeting, relay beacons, shield generators, and the launch mechanisms of the planet killers. One by one, the Dominion's most devastating weapons were disabled before they could be fired. It was not a battle, it was a dismantling, every move calculated. Every weakness exploited. The human fleet operated with purpose they had studied. The Dominion learned how they thought, how they moved, and now they were using that knowledge to bring them down piece by piece. Carax roared for his fighters to launch, for interceptors to swarm and crush the invaders. But it was already too late. Waves of human drones, hastily built and barely space-worthy, yet packed with explosives, surged forward. They overwhelmed Dominion lines through sheer numbers and raw aggression. Clearing paths for heavier ships to follow, the Dominion fleet began to buckle under the pressure, and for the first time in the campaign, Carax felt real fear as the command ship shuddered from a direct hit. He clutched the console, demanding status reports. Shields failing, weapons offline, engines damaged. And then the final word: boarding. Carax's eyes narrowed. He had seen desperate acts before, but this was unprecedented. No enemy had ever dared board a Dominion flagship. He drew his plasma blade, summoned his elite guard, and prepared to meet them head-on. He would not let his ship fall without a fight. The humans breached through airlocks using primitive yet effective explosives, flooding in like a tide, wearing armor forged from salvaged parts and carrying weapons crafted with brutal intent. They fought with a rage that transcended strategy. Every corner of the ship became a battleground. Carax's forces fought back with disciplined precision, but for every human they cut down, more took their place, tireless, relentless, undeterred. The battle surged toward the command center where Carax made his stand. His elite guard fell one by one against a tide of enemies that refused to yield, until finally Carax was face to face with one of the human leaders. The man was battered armor, scorched blade in hand, eyes locked with his like steel. The Dren general lunged with all his strength, but the human sidestepped, struck, and drove his weapon deep into Carax's side. The general collapsed to his knees, vision dimming as blood poured from the wound. "You are a primitive species," Carax spat. "How did you do this?" The human crouched to meet his gaze, voice calm and steady. "You underestimated us. You thought we would break. But all you did was give us something to fight for. You made us better." And as the human turned and ordered his people to take the ship end, the war, Carax faded into darkness. His last thought not of glory or conquest, but of the mistake he had made in ever believing Earth would be an easy target. In the days that followed, the Dominion fleet, shattered remnants scattered and destroyed. Resistance forces rose in unison, driving the last invaders from the planet Earth. Had survived not as a conquered world, but as a defiant force forged through fire and loss. Their victory was not celebrated with parades or monuments, but with silence and determination. They dismantled what was left of the Dominion's technology, buried their dead, and began to rebuild stronger than before. Not as nations, but as one people. The invasion that had begun with arrogance ended in humiliation, and the galaxy would never again see humanity as weak. They had proven something deeper, something terrifying. They were not just survivors. They were a force that could never be broken, and now the stars themselves would have to learn that hard lesson, just as the Dominion had. When the last of the Dominion ships were driven from Earth's skies and their banners fell into the dust, humanity did not erupt in celebration. There were no grand speeches, no triumphant parades. The victory had been too costly, too painful, and too hard won for shallow glory. The world was scarred, cities lay in ruin, families shattered, communities burned to ash. But out of those ashes, something new emerged. Not a return to the fractured nations that once fought over lines on a map, but a unified will forged in resistance and sealed in blood. Humanity had not simply survived, it had evolved. The scattered resistance groups that once fought in isolation now stood together, bound by the memory of everything they had lost and everything they had overcome. The Dominion, which had once been the greatest military force in the galaxy, was now a cautionary tale. Their arrogance, their overconfidence, their belief in technological superiority had led them to underestimate the one thing they could not quantify: the human spirit. What began as an invasion had become a war, and what began as a war ended in transformation. Humanity learned to adapt faster than any algorithm, to think beyond conventional tactics, to weaponize not just their machines but their pain, their fear, their rage, and above all, their hope. They learned that survival is not just a matter of strength, but of belief in something worth fighting for, worth dying for, and ultimately worth rebuilding for. Across the globe, people gathered to mourn the fallen, to bury the dead with honor, and to rebuild with purpose. Dominion technology was salvaged, not for domination, but for defense. Monuments were not built to generals or battles, but to nurses who stayed behind in war zones, to children who carried messages through the rubble, to farmers who grew food for the resistance, to every ordinary person who did something extraordinary. In the face of extinction, they did not glorify violence, but they remembered the cost of freedom and swore it would never be taken from them. Again, ships once meant for war were repurposed for exploration. Satellites were rebuilt not for surveillance, but for connection. The world had learned a lesson. No invader, no tyrant, no empire could erase the real power of humanity. Was never its weapons or machines. It was its resilience, its refusal to give up, even when logic said it should, even when hope seemed foolish, and even when the night seemed endless. The story of Earth's survival spread across the stars, whispered between traders and encoded in intercepted signals. It became legend, not just of resistance, but of warning to all who might one day believe that Earth could be taken easily. And for those on Earth, it became a reminder of who they were and who they had become. Because in facing the edge of annihilation, humanity had discovered what it truly meant to live. The lesson of this story echoes beyond fiction into our own lives. In every challenge we face, in every injustice we see, in every moment where giving up feels easier than fighting on, the human spirit has the capacity to rise above it, to stand when everything says fall, to believe when everything says break. We live in a world where fear, division, and despair can feel like insurmountable forces. But like the people in this story, we are not defined by what threatens us. We are defined by how we respond to it. The real lesson is not about war or victory, but about unity and willpower, about how people can come together, not just to survive, but to build something greater than themselves, something lasting, something hopeful. And in that truth, there is a reminder for all of us that no matter how dark the future may seem, we have within us the light to change it, just as they did and just as we must.